Hello, and welcome to my presentation on my research proposal. I have given this presentation the title of Do Masks Harm Student Understanding of Lecture Content? Because that was the main question that I was looking to address with this research proposal. So throughout the nation and abroad, schools have universally, almost, put in place social distancing guidelines to allow people to go back to school despite the currently raging pandemic. And I believe both students and professors are heavily feeling the effects of this change in the way that education is run in general. And so with my research proposal, I was looking to examine the effects that mask wearing specifically has on the classroom and students' ability to understand and receive lecture content. Throughout my literature review for the introduction, I was having quite a bit of difficulty finding empirical research that was directly related to education within the pandemic. Most of the research that I did find was actually from the medical community, and it pretty heavily focused on the impact that mask wearing has for the medical staff when they're attempting to communicate emotional content to their customers or patients. However, I did find one older study from 2008 that I think provided a necessary counterbalance to these other three studies because it focused on informational content. So this is where the main assumption of my proposal came in, and it had to do with the difference between emotional versus informational content. Because the research that I was able to find was both focused on emotional and informational content, I had to find a way to apply that to the field of education and make a determination about where I thought educational content fell in terms of whether it's highly emotional or highly informational, and I decided that it made the most sense for it to be designated as mostly informational with a little bit of emotional weight to it. So my main hypothesis is that the experimental group will have a significant and moderately lower mean quiz score. So the experiment itself uses convenience sampling at universities across the nation. I'm proposing about 1,000 participants in order to have a big enough size. And the experiment will consist of two separate videos, one in which a professor is giving a lecture and is wearing a mask, and another which a professor is giving the same lecture without wearing a mask. And the students will be broken in half and randomly assigned to one of those two videos. The group that sees the mask wearing professor will be the experimental group, and the group that sees the non-mask wearing professor will be the control group. So the reason why I'm going with a video for this is because I thought it was pretty much impossible to rule out other confounding variables if I tried to do any sort of in-person live presentation where a professor gives one presentation to one group without a mask and then to another group with a mask, because it would be impossible to really tell if the two lectures were similar enough. So my proposed idea is to create a review board that will examine two sets of 3 videos, one for each side of the independent variable, and determine which two are the most similar in terms of engagement and voice inflection and just all over similarity, and use those two within the experimental context. So because of the assumed interplay that I'm proposing in this paper regarding the high weight of informational content and the lower but still present weight of emotional content, I am hypothesizing that there will be a significant and moderate effect size between groups on our ANOVA test, Because we have two levels of the independent variable which are being directly manipulated, we have two groups, and that is a categorical variable, and then our dependent variable, which is just the mean quiz results from each group, is a quantitative variable. So we are going to be running a ANOVA test to determine the effect size between groups. We're looking for about a 0.66 effect size to call that a moderate effect size, and we are expecting the p-value to be below 0.05 in order to determine significance. So because the pandemic is such a recent phenomena, and there's not a lot of peer-reviewed empirical research, I thought it was necessary to add this layer of the assumption about the interplay between emotional and informational content. So if our hypothesis is supported and we do see that significant and moderate effect size, then I think we can continue to study the truth of that assumption and determine its validity. But I think there's sort of two ways in which the hypothesis and that subsequent assumption could not be supported. First of all, we could just not find a significant difference between the two groups, or like a very small, a significant one, but a very small effect size. Or we could find a significant difference between the two groups that was also much higher than a moderate effect size. And that, I think, would kind of put the proposed assumption regarding the interplay between emotional content and informational content at the level of the student interaction into question. And perhaps it means that emotional content is actually a lot more important, because that means that the results of this experiment would line up with the other emotionally focused experiments, which I discussed in my introduction. So I think that the biggest limitation of this research proposal is that the experiment is based off of using video presentations, and that's really just because I don't think it would be possible to rule out confounding variables otherwise. In the future, with advances in augmented reality, such as Microsoft's HoloLens, which is just a clear glass lens that goes over your entire face, and they're able to project holograms onto the screen to make it appear in real life and look very convincing. Once that gets to a certain point, you might actually be able to set up an experimental design where you have a professor giving one lecture, and the participants are told that they're just testing the augmented reality's ability to project stuff like the slideshow information onto their screen. But really, at the same time, the experimental group is actually having a digital face mask grafted onto the professor's face, and the control group is not, and they don't know that that difference is happening, and then you test the differences in the quiz results. So yeah, that's about everything for my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great winter break.